Winston Churchill owed his extraordinary career not only to his own remarkable talents, but also to the opportunities and example provided by his family. He was the third successive generation of his paternal family to become a cabinet minister, and he modelled his political ideology and many of his policies on those of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill. There's a picture of Lord Randolph at his prime. Lord Randolph was the younger son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, and he had a short but brilliant political career, which culminated in his appointment as Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the House of Commons in 1886. But he resigned after only a few months, and he never held office again. Nevertheless, he remained an active and important politician until his death in 1895, aged only 46. Lord Randolph saw little of Winston as a boy, and he was sometimes critical of his conduct. Consequently, it has been claimed that Winston succeeded in life despite, or perhaps because, he was neglected and disparaged by his father. Boris Johnson, for example, in his recent book, The Churchill Factor, has stated that Lord Randolph treated Winston abominably. That verdict is unjustified. When Winston reread his father's letters many years later, he wrote, quote, "I feel that I did not at the time appreciate how much he cared and thought for me." In 1891, for example, Lord Randolph wrote to his son, "You cannot think how pleased I was to get your interesting and well-written letter and to learn that you are getting on well." But Randolph was determined that Winston should make something of his life and not become another idle member of the upper classes. He made his son aware at an early age that he needed to succeed by his own efforts. Looking back in middle age, Winston recalled, "The greatest and most powerful influence in my early life was, of course, my father. I conceived an intense admiration and affection for him, and, after his death, for his memory. I read industriously almost every word he had spoken and learnt by heart large portions of his speeches. I took my politics almost unquestioningly from him. He seemed to me to have possessed in his prime the key alike to popular oratory and political action." Young Winston hoped that when he grew up, he would become his father's political aide, like Herbert Gladstone or Austen Chamberlain. But he was only 20 when Lord Randolph died in 1895, and he later wrote of his loss, quote, "All my dreams of comradeship with him were ended. There remained for me only to pursue his aims and vindicate his memory." At that time, however, Winston was a novice soldier, not a politician. Winston's military career was largely due to Lord Randolph. After inspecting his young son's huge collection of toy soldiers, he had suggested that Winston should join the army. I'm afraid this is a 1950s illustration from a children's book about Churchill, but nevertheless it makes the point of the father's interest in Winston having a military career. Randolph ensured that Winston was put in the army class at Harrow and then received the private tuition that helped him to gain a place at Sandhurst. That led to a commission in the cavalry, which enabled him to experience conflict on 3 continents between 1895 and 1900. He capitalized on those encounters by becoming a well-paid war reporter and author. In that respect, he followed the example of Lord Randolph, who had published an account of his travels in South Africa, first in the press and then in book form. Winston's earliest war reports from Cuba in 1895 were published in the Daily Graphic, the paper his father had written for. Winston's military experiences brought him to public attention, but he soon left the army in order to pursue a parliamentary career like his father. His preoccupation with his father's political career was reflected in his only novel, Savrola, in which the fate of the eponymous hero closely resembled that of Lord Randolph. Winston's first political speech in 1897 was made to a branch of the Primrose League, a Conservative voluntary organisation established by Lord Randolph and his friends. As a parliamentary candidate in 1899, Winston designated himself a Tory Democrat. That was the creed associated with Lord Randolph. At the 1900 general election, Winston was returned as a Conservative MP for Oldham, where his father had spoken and had political connections. He made his maiden speech in the House of Commons from the same seat that Lord Randolph had occupied after his resignation. He concluded his speech by attributing its kind reception not to his own merits, but to, quote, a certain splendid memory which many honourable members still preserve. And there's a Punch cartoon of the shadow of Lord Randolph, as it were, the ghost of Lord Randolph, keeping a fatherly eye on Winston's maiden speech. Winston aped Randolph's parliamentary mannerisms and was caricatured as an imitation of his father. These are two Vanity Fair cartoons, one of Lord Randolph on the left and Winston on the right. And of course, you can see the stance, the gait is very similar. That imitation of his father extended to parliamentary tactics as well. Winston formed a small group of Tory freelances below the gangway in the Commons that consciously recalled Lord Randolph's activities with the so-called Fourth Party in the early 1880s. Winston also took up his father's commitment to various causes, most notably a reduction in government expenditure. He described his campaign for economy as a cause that he had inherited from his father, who had resigned as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1886 in protest at high defence spending. Winston's familiarity with his father's views was solidified by the 4 years that he spent researching and writing the life of Lord Randolph Churchill. The book was largely based on Lord Randolph's extensive archive, to which his son was given exclusive access. Work on the biography brought Winston into close contact with a number of his father's influential friends across the political spectrum, including Lord Rosebery, Hicks Beach, and John Morley. The Life of Lord Randolph was published to much acclaim in 1906. Its appeal owed much to Winston's skill as a writer, but it was also enlivened by the outspoken nature of Randolph's speeches and letters. Winston earned £6,000 from the biography, which helped him to pursue a parliamentary career. But research for the book also led him to conclude that Lord Randolph had been shabbily treated by the Tories, and that increased his own growing alienation from the Conservative Party. That's a picture of Winston in 1904. Winston's decision to join the Liberal Party in 1904 was influenced by his father's example in other ways as well. Although Lord Randolph lived and died as a Conservative, he adopted increasingly liberal views after his resignation. He rejected protectionism in favour of free trade, as did Winston when he opposed Joseph Chamberlain's tariff reform campaign in 1903. Winston then joined forces with other free trade Tories and Liberals, many of whom had been associates of Lord Randolph. He described the Liberal landslide at the 1906 general election, which was a triumph for free trade, as a justification of his father's career. As a Liberal minister in the Edwardian era, Winston's attitude to industrial relations and social reform echoed those of his father in the later years of his life. Randolph had recognised that the democratic electorate expected the state to protect their welfare in new ways. In response to that demand, Randolph supported the coal miners' demand for an 8-hour day and introduced his own licensing bill to promote temperance. In 1908, as a Liberal, Winston expressed his pride at supporting the 8 hours bill for which his father had worked, and cited his father's support for temperance reform when he endorsed the Liberal licensing bill. There was, however, one important issue on which Winston as a Liberal broke with his father's policy: Home Rule for Ireland. Lord Randolph had been a fervent opponent of Home Rule, and Winston followed his example as a young man. But in 1908 he changed his stance and supported Home Rule in line with Liberal policy. That was an expedient move by an ambitious politician, but it was one that he sought to reconcile with his father's views. A friend of his father, Wilfrid Blunt, told him, erroneously, that Lord Randolph had in fact been something of a Home Ruler. When Winston spoke in support of Home Rule at Belfast, where Lord Randolph had denounced that policy in 1886, Winston spoke of his reverence for his father's memory and put a different gloss on Randolph's famous words, "Ulster will fight." As First Lord of the Admiralty before the First World War, Winston strengthened the Royal Navy in response to the threat posed by the expanding German fleet. From his youth, he had followed his father's example and been a strong supporter of British naval supremacy. During the First World War, Winston, as a minister and briefly as a soldier, faced challenges beyond any experienced by his father. Yet his advocacy of an attack on the Gallipoli Peninsula in order to knock Turkey out of the war may have been partly inspired by paternal example. He was certainly aware that in 1885, Lord Randolph had suggested that a British seizure of Gallipoli would be supported by a peace-loving House of Commons. After the Great War, Winston, first as a Liberal member of Lloyd George's coalition government, and then as a minister in Baldwin's Conservative government, followed his father in trying to create a Liberal-Conservative alignment. Lord Randolph had welcomed the Conservative alliance with the Liberal Unionists in 1886 and had coined the phrase the Unionist Party. At the 1924 general election, Winston advocated a Liberal-Conservative alliance on the lines espoused by his father in 1886. He presented himself once more as a Tory Democrat, and his return to the Conservative Party was facilitated by the support he received from several of his father's friends, including Balfour and Carson. Winston was delighted when Baldwin made him Chancellor of the Exchequer, the office his father had briefly held. He still possessed Lord Randolph's robes of office and dispatch box. As Chancellor, he sought to reduce military spending, like his father, but he was careful not to emulate his resignation. While Winston opposed the general strike, he criticised the mine owners, including his relative Lord Londonderry, for not offering more generous terms to the miners. Lord Randolph had adopted a similar position in regard to both the miners and Lord Londonderry in the early 1890s. Winston's attitude to the British Empire in the interwar period has generally been categorised as that of a die-hard reactionary. He remained true, however, to his father's concept of a liberal empire based not on force, but on improving the conditions of the mass of the people in the colonies. His views on India in particular echoed those of Lord Randolph, who had been Secretary of State for India. Like his father, Winston was conscious of the fragility of the Raj in the face of external threats, principally from Russia. Both men considered that India was wholly unsuited to Westminster-style democratic politics. In his campaign against the national government's India Bill in the early 1930s, Churchill turned for support to the National Union of Conservative Associations, the same body that Lord Randolph had utilised in 1884 to put pressure on the Tory leadership. Lord Randolph also had views on Egypt and South Africa, which Winston seems to have taken to heart. In his 1891 account of his travels through South Africa, Randolph praised the magnanimity of Gladstone's government in making peace with the Boers on favourable terms in 1881. During the Second Anglo-Boer War in 1900, Winston urged Salisbury's Conservative government to also adopt a magnanimous stance towards the Boers. Lord Randolph was initially a strong opponent of the British intervention in Egypt in 1882, whereas Winston supported the continuation of a British presence there. Nevertheless, both father and son sought to improve the welfare of the fellahin, that's to say the Egyptian peasantry, and both questioned the value of the Suez Canal in time of war. Winston's attitude to European politics recalled the stance of his father in a major speech at Dartford in 1886. Randolph had then declared that Britain's support for liberty and freedom abroad was based on self-interest because, quote, "the precious liberties which we enjoy and the freedom of Europe from tyranny and despotism are indissolubly connected." It was that sentiment that lay behind Winston's opposition to both Bolshevik Russia and Nazi Germany in the interwar period. To ensure peace and liberty in Europe, Randolph had advocated united action by the great powers. That foreshadowed Winston's strong support for the League of Nations after the First World War and for the United Nations after the Second. Winston's decade out of office from 1929 to 1939, his so-called wilderness years, somewhat paralleled his father's later years out of office. Both men felt alienated from their party's leaders and policies, and both were viewed with distrust by many of their former colleagues. Winston spent much of the 1930s at Chartwell, his country home in Kent, where there were many reminders of his father. Behind Winston's desk, in his study, where he wrote his many books and speeches, was a portrait of Lord Randolph by Edwin Ward. Lord Randolph as a minister in 1885, while many of the books in the room contained his father's bookplate. Winston accepted the premiership in 1940 on the condition that he also became Minister of Defence with authority over all three armed services. That unified control of the armed services was unprecedented, but it reflected the thinking of Lord Randolph. He had argued in a memorandum reprinted by Winston that professional servicemen should replace the civilians in charge of the War Office and the Admiralty, but under the aegis of a single civilian Secretary of State, responsible for all military expenditure. Randolph believed that would ensure better coordination between the two services and greater efficiency. Winston argued for a similar change in the interwar years, citing his father's views. Winston's role as the leader of a tripartisan coalition government during the Second World War was in line with his father's advocacy after his resignation of what he termed a national party, one which would include conservative, liberal, and radical elements. Winston had concluded that his father would be remembered as a national rather than as a party figure, and he sought the same reputation for himself. He happily suspended party politics during the Second World War, and he regretted the decision of the Labour Party to leave the coalition in 1945. At the resultant general election, he urged electors to vote national, not party. During and after the Second World War, Winston's courting of the United States was boosted by his family link with that country. He owed his American heritage to his father's determination, against parental wishes, to marry an American Jennie Jerome, or Jennie Churchill, of course, as she became. Lord Randolph, moreover, anticipated Winston's enthusiasm for close Anglo-American relations. Randolph made 3 visits to the USA, called for the union of the English-speaking peoples, and predicted that the United States would help Britain if it was ever engaged in a European war. When Winston addressed the US Congress in 1941, he referred not only to his American mother, but also to his father's support for democracy, enshrined in the phrase, "Trust the people." As leader of the Conservatives in the post-war period, Winston resurrected his father's political ideology and republished his life of Lord Randolph. Winston was the Grand Master of the Primrose League, which his father had founded, and he sought to make that organisation, quote, "the vanguard of Tory democracy." At the same time, Winston tried to revive a liberal-conservative alliance on the lines of that in 1886. He also followed his father in campaigning for governmental economy and in opposing the high defence spending of the Labour government. He claimed that Lord Randolph would have shared his opposition to independence for India and for Burma, which he had annexed in 1886. When Winston was criticised for adhering to the same views that he had held in early life, he countered that political principles did not change with the moods of the electorate. He also claimed that Lord Randolph would not have been out of place in the post-war House of Commons. Harold Macmillan observed that Lord Randolph's aims and ambitions were never out of Winston's mind, while Brendan Bracken noted that Winston would not brook criticism of his father. When Winston was asked in old age which person from history he would most like to talk to, he answered unhesitatingly his father. That wish had earlier prompted him to write The Dream, an imagined conversation with Lord Randolph in his painting studio at Chartwell in 1946. The Dream reflected Winston's lifelong affection for his father and desire to live up to his expectations. Randolph concluded their imaginary conversation with these words: "Winston, when I hear you talk, I really wonder you didn't go into politics. You might have done a lot to help. You might even have made a name for yourself." Winston's death and funeral in 1965 also illustrated his love of his father. He died, as he had predicted, on the anniversary of Lord Randolph's death in 1895. He was then given a state funeral in London, but he was buried, in accordance with his wishes, at Blenheim next to the grave of his father and mother. During his long life, Winston had honoured his pledge to pursue Lord Randolph's aims and vindicate his memory. His filial piety had a political as well as a personal significance, for the greatness of his achievement owed much to the example and influence of Lord Randolph.